Part 1. The origins of the Vikings. Far to the north, beyond the forests of Europe and the great rivers that carried trade, there stretched a land of breathtaking beauty and brutal hardship. This was Scandinavia, the birthplace of the people we now call the Vikings. The landscape was dramatic. Towering fjords carved by ancient glaciers, dark pine forests, roaring waterfalls, and endless stretches of icy seas. Winters were long and merciless, blanketing the villages in snow for months at a time, while summers were short, a fleeting chance for crops to grow and animals to graze. Life here was never easy. The soil was thin, rocky, and unforgiving, so farming yielded little. A family might struggle to grow enough barley for bread, or enough hay to keep their animals alive through the winter. Hunger was a constant shadow, always threatening. And yet, it was in this crucible of hardship that the Viking spirit was forged. To survive, the people of Scandinavia had to be resourceful, tough, and daring. In their wooden longhouses, families lived closely together, huddled around a central fire. These homes were built of timber and turf, their thick walls protecting against the biting cold winds that howled in from the sea. The air inside was smoky, the smell of burning would mingling with the scent of animals, since cattle, goats, and sheep were often kept under the same roof during the worst of winter. Life revolved around family, clan, and survival. Every man, woman, and child had their role to play. But beyond survival, the Scandinavians had ambition. They were dreamers and storytellers, weaving sagas of gods, monsters, and heroes. Around the fire, they spoke of Odin, the All-Father who sacrificed an eye for wisdom; Thor, the thunder god who defended mankind with his mighty hammer; and Loki, the trickster whose schemes often brought chaos. These myths were more than stories. They shaped the way people saw the world. A place of danger, yes, but also a place where the brave could rise to glory. And then there was the sea. The ocean was not a barrier to the Scandinavians, but a highway. From childhood, boys learned to row, to fish, to read the winds and stars. They watched their fathers carve sleek ships from oak, vessels that seemed almost alive, cutting across the waves like arrows. To these people, the sea promised more than just fish and trade. It promised escape from the narrow limits of their homeland. It promised adventure. It promised wealth. By the late 8th century, whispers spread of fertile lands across the sea, green pastures in the British Isles, wealthy monasteries filled with gold and silver, towns and villages that had never seen warriors arrive by ship. The idea was intoxicating. Why struggle to survive in the frozen north, when riches lay waiting just across the waters? The first raiding parties were small, little more than experiments, groups of men seeking fortune. But soon, these expeditions grew bolder, larger, more organized. And then, in the year 793, history changed forever. A fleet of Viking ships appeared off the coast of Northumbria, in England. Their target was the holy island of Lindisfarne, home to a monastery renowned for its treasures. To the monks who lived there, it must have seemed like the end of the world. The Vikings stormed ashore, armed with axes and swords, their shields painted with terrifying designs. They slaughtered, they plundered, they set fire to the sacred place. Word of the attack spread like wildfire across Europe. The chroniclers of the time wrote in horror that heathen men had come from the north, bringing destruction and chaos. For the Europeans of the time, this was unthinkable. Monasteries were sacred, protected not by walls or armies, but by faith. No Christian army would dare attack such a place. But the Vikings did not share this reverence. To them, a monastery was just another storehouse of wealth, poorly defended and ripe for the taking. And in that moment, they revealed a terrifying truth. Nowhere was safe. The raid on Lindisfarne was not just an act of violence. It was a declaration. The world had entered a new age, the Viking Age. Over the next centuries, These people from the north would raid, trade, explore, and settle across vast territories, from the rivers of Russia to the shores of North America. Their story was only beginning. Yet to understand why the Vikings became who they were, we must never forget where they came from. They were born of a land of extremes, a land that demanded resilience, courage, and vision. They were shaped by myth and legend, driven by hunger and ambition, and united by their mastery of the sea. Out of these roots grew one of the most remarkable chapters in human history, a chapter that still captures our imagination today. So when we picture the Vikings, tall figures with shields and axes, their ships cutting through stormy waters, we are really seeing the children of a land that forged them to be strong, restless, and unafraid of the unknown. They were not monsters, as some medieval writers claimed. They were survivors, dreamers, and seekers of glory. And their journey, as we will see, would take them farther than anyone of their time could have imagined. Part 2. The First Raids and the Shock of Europe. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 was not an isolated event. It was the spark that lit the fire of an age. For the people of Britain and mainland Europe, it seemed as if demons had risen from the sea. Tall men with wild hair and beards, clad in leather and chain, carrying axes and round shields. Chroniclers described them as wolves among lambs, merciless and unstoppable. But to the Vikings themselves, Lindisfarne was only the beginning. In the years that followed, Viking ships became a familiar and terrifying sight along the coasts of England, Ireland, and France. They moved with shocking speed, appearing seemingly out of nowhere. One moment, the horizon was empty. The next, dark sails filled the sky, and long, sleek ships sliced through the waves. By the time the alarm bells rang, it was already too late. The Vikings would storm ashore, plunder what they could, and vanish back into the sea before reinforcements could arrive. The choice of targets was no accident. Monasteries, rich in gold, silver, and manuscripts, were easy prey. They stood unguarded, their inhabitants devoted to prayer rather than warfare. To the Vikings, who lived in a world where honor was tied to bravery, raiding these undefended sites was not cowardice, it was opportunity. Their gods demanded courage, not obedience. If treasure lay unprotected, it was theirs to take. But soon, the raids expanded beyond monasteries. The Vikings began attacking towns, villages, and even cities. In Ireland, they struck at Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, leaving behind fire and blood. In England, they targeted York and London, shaking the heart of Anglo-Saxon power. In France, they sailed up the Seine and burned their way to the very gates of Paris. Europe had never faced anything like this. The key to their success was the ship, the legendary longship. Sleek, symmetrical, and terrifyingly fast, it was a masterpiece of design. With a shallow draft, it could glide through open seas or slip silently up shallow rivers. This gave the Vikings a devastating advantage. They could attack deep inland, far from the coast where no one thought danger could come. Imagine living in a village hundreds of miles from the sea, thinking you were safe, only to hear the war cry of Vikings echoing down the river. For many, it must have felt like magic or divine punishment. The longship was more than a weapon. It was a symbol. Each ship was carved with intricate designs, often with a dragon's head on the prow to scare spirits and enemies alike. Warriors believed the ship had a soul, almost like a living creature. And on these vessels, they carried not only weapons but entire communities. Raiding parties were sometimes followed by settlers, men, women, and children ready to carve out new homes in foreign lands. As the raids intensified, kings and rulers across Europe scrambled to respond. They built fortresses, raised armies, and prayed desperately for protection. But they were not just fighting an enemy. They were facing a storm. The Vikings did not come as a single nation. They came as countless bands of chieftains and warriors, each driven by hunger for wealth, glory, and land. Defeating one fleet only meant another would soon appear. Yet the raids were not mindless violence. Behind the fury of their axes was a cold logic. Gold and silver were essential in Viking society, not only as wealth, but as a way to gain loyalty. A great chieftain needed treasure to reward his followers, and raiding provided it in abundance. In a world where honor and loyalty were everything, a leader's success in plunder determined his power at home. It is easy to imagine the fear the Vikings inspired, but what is often forgotten is the awe. To many, they seemed invincible. Men who could face down kings and armies, vanish into the sea, and return again and again. And while medieval monks painted them as savage beasts, there were others who saw opportunity. Local rulers sometimes made alliances with Vikings, hiring them as mercenaries or paying them to fight against rivals. In fact, many European kingdoms soon learned that gold could be a weapon as effective as swords. Paying the Vikings to leave, or even to fight for them, became common. Still, the brutality of the raids left scars. Entire regions were depopulated. Churches were looted, relics destroyed, libraries burned. For Christians of the time, it felt like a direct assault on their faith. One monk wrote that the raids were a punishment from God, sent because of the sins of mankind. This idea spread widely. The Vikings were not merely enemies of kingdoms, but enemies of Christ himself. And yet, from the Viking perspective, it was never about religion. They did not hate Christianity. They barely understood it. To them, it was just another belief system, one of many in a world full of gods and spirits. They attacked monasteries not because they were Christian, but because they were wealthy and weak. It was practical, not personal. By the mid-9th century, Europe began to realize that the Viking threat was not temporary. These raids were not isolated attacks. They were the new reality. The coasts of England, Ireland, and France lived in constant fear. Bells were hung in villages not only to call people to church, but to warn of approaching ships. Watchtowers rose along rivers. But no matter how hard rulers tried, the Vikings always seemed one step ahead. And then, something remarkable happened. Some Viking groups stopped leaving. Instead of plundering and returning home, they began to stay. In Ireland, they established long forts, fortified bases along rivers and coasts, which eventually grew into full-fledged towns like Dublin. In England, they began settling farmland, intermarrying with locals, and creating permanent communities. In France, they demanded land in exchange for peace, a deal that would one day create Normandy. The Viking Age was no longer just about raiding. It was about expansion, settlement, and transformation. The world was changing, and the Vikings were shaping that change with fire, steel, and ambition. For the people of Europe, it was terrifying. For the Vikings, it was destiny. They were no longer bound by the limits of their harsh homeland. The sea had given them wings, and the world was wide open. The raids that began in 793 had grown into something far greater, a tidal wave of conquest and migration. And as the 9th century unfolded, the question was no longer whether the Vikings would come. It was how far they would go, and who, if anyone, could stop them. Part 3. Life, Honor, and the Viking Way. To understand the Vikings not just as raiders but as people, we must step away from the burning monasteries and look into their everyday lives, into their homes, their families, and their values. For the Viking Age was not only about war, it was about survival, honor, and community. Imagine walking into a Viking village in the 9th century. The air is crisp, carrying the salty scent of the sea mixed with the smoke of wood fires. Long houses line the settlement, sturdy structures built from timber, stone, and turf. These homes were not grand, but they were practical. Long, narrow buildings with thick walls that kept in the warmth. Inside, a central fire burned day and night, the smoke curling up to escape through holes in the roof. Families, sometimes 3 generations deep, slept along the sides of a hall on wooden benches covered with furs. At the far end, animals might be penned in during the harshest winters, their body heat adding to the warmth. Daily life was a constant battle against the elements. Men farmed the rocky soil, raising barley, rye, and oats, while tending to cattle, sheep, and goats. Women worked just as hard, spinning wool, weaving cloth, preparing meals, and managing households. In truth, Viking society gave women more rights than many other parts of medieval Europe. They could own property, inherit land, and even divorce their husbands if mistreated. A widow could become a powerful figure in her community, controlling wealth and alliances. But survival was never guaranteed. Crops could fail, winters could kill, and so, for many families, the sea became their lifeline. Fishing, trading, and raiding all offered what the land could not. Every child grew up knowing that life was fragile, and that only strength and courage could carve a path forward. At the heart of Viking culture was honor. Honor was everything. It defined a man's reputation, his standing in the community, and even his fate in the afterlife. To die bravely in battle was the highest ideal, for it meant a place in Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where warriors feasted and prepared for the final battle at the end of time. Cowardice, on the other hand, brought shame that could stain an entire family for generations. This obsession with honor fueled the Viking way of war. Battles were not just about winning. They were about proving courage. Warriors often fought in close ranks, their round shields forming walls, their axes and swords flashing in the sun. But duels, one-on-one fights called holmgangs, were also common ways to settle disputes. A man's worth was measured not only in wealth or land, but in his bravery when steel met steel. And yet, the Vikings were not mindless brutes. They valued cunning as much as strength. Their sagas are filled with heroes who outwitted enemies with clever tricks or bold strategies. A true warrior was not just fierce, he was shrewd, able to seize opportunity when it appeared. In their leisure, the Vikings gathered for feasts that could last days. These were moments of release after months of toil or war. Mead and ale flowed freely. Horns were raised in toasts, and skalds, the poets and storytellers, recited epic tales of gods and ancestors. Around the fire, sagas came to life. Stories of Thor's battles with giants, Loki's treacherous schemes, and the tragic fate of heroes bound by destiny. These stories were more than entertainment. They were the heartbeat of the culture, teaching values, history, and the meaning of courage. Music, too, filled their halls. Simple flutes, drums, and stringed instruments accompanied the songs of warriors and women alike. Jewelry, finely crafted from silver, bronze, and gold, gleamed on necks and arms, not only as decoration, but as symbols of loyalty and reward. A chieftain who rewarded his followers with gifts won their devotion. A stingy leader, no matter how skilled in battle, risked betrayal. In their ships, the Vikings carried these values with them. Life on a longship was harsh and disciplined. Warriors rowed for hours, their backs aching, their hands blistered, driven by the rhythm of the sea and the beat of a drummer's call. At night, they pulled the ships onto shore, inverted them, and camped beneath for shelter. Meals were simple: dried fish, bread, or meat when they could find it. Yet camaraderie was strong. Every man on board was bound not only by loyalty to his chieftain, but by shared hardship. The sea was both friend and foe. Storms could destroy entire fleets, waves smashing ships against rocks. To sail into unknown waters demanded extraordinary courage. But it was precisely this courage that defined them. For the Vikings, to turn back out of fear was unthinkable. Better to risk death on the waves than live in shame at home. Their religion reflected this worldview. The Norse gods were not distant, perfect beings, but flawed and powerful figures who embodied the struggles of life itself. Odin, the All-Father, sought wisdom at any cost, even sacrificing an eye. Thor defended humanity with brute force and stubbornness. Frey and Freya represented fertility, love, and the cycles of life. And looming over all was Ragnarok, the prophesied end of the world, when gods and giants would clash, and even the mighty would fall. For the Vikings, life was temporary, but glory was eternal. Even their funerals reflected this pursuit of honor. The dead were buried with their possessions, weapons, jewelry, even ships, so they could sail into the afterlife prepared. In some cases, slaves or animals were sacrificed to accompany a chieftain on his journey. To outsiders, these rites seemed barbaric, but to the Vikings, they were acts of respect, ensuring the dead entered the next world in strength. Yet, despite their fierce warrior culture, the Vikings were not only defined by violence. They were builders, settlers, and dreamers. They carved runes into stones to mark great deeds, leaving messages that still stand today. They established laws, assemblies called things, where disputes were settled not by kings, but by communities. In these gatherings, even common men had a voice, a striking contrast to the feudal systems emerging elsewhere in Europe. This balance between war and law, violence and community, survival and celebration, made Viking society unique. They could burn cities one season and build towns the next. They could terrify kings while honoring women with rites rare in their time. They were a paradox, a people both brutal and sophisticated, savage and civilized. As Viking influence spread, so did their way of life. Settlements in Ireland, England, and beyond carried their customs into foreign lands. They intermarried, traded, and shared their sagas with new audiences. And everywhere they went, they left an imprint, not only of fire and blood, but of culture, ideas, and resilience. To see the Vikings only as raiders is to miss the larger picture. They were men and women shaped by a harsh land, guided by a code of honor, driven by hunger and hope. Their ships carried not only warriors, but families and futures. Their axes carved paths, but their stories carved legacies. This was the Viking way: to live fiercely, to die bravely, and to ensure that their names would never be forgotten. And as the 9th and 10th centuries unfolded, they would prove that legacy not only through raids, but through kingdoms, cultures, and empires that bore their mark. Part 4. Voyages to the edge of the world. The Vikings were not content to remain in their northern homelands or to raid the coasts of Europe alone. For them, the sea was not a barrier but a highway, a living force that carried them farther and farther from home. What made the Viking Age so extraordinary was not just the violence of their raids, but the astonishing scale of their exploration. At a time when most people rarely traveled beyond their villages, the Vikings stretched their horizons to the ends of the known world, and even beyond. Their ships, the legendary longships, were their wings, built of strong oak, with overlapping planks sealed with tar and wool. These vessels were light, flexible, and fast. They could survive the open sea, yet slip silently up rivers. With them, the Vikings did what no other people of their age dared. They pushed into the unknown. The North Atlantic expeditions. By the 9th century, Viking sailors had already colonized the Faroe Islands, small, wind-swept rocks in the North Atlantic. But that was just a stepping stone. In 874, according to Icelandic sagas, a chieftain named Ingolfr Arnarson set sail westward and established the first permanent settlement in Iceland. Imagine arriving there for the first time. Black volcanic landscapes, geysers of boiling water, and mountains capped with snow. It was harsh, but it was land. New land untouched, waiting to be claimed. Soon, thousands of settlers followed, fleeing crowded homelands or seeking fortune. Iceland became a Viking stronghold, a land of free farmers, poets, and warriors, where the sagas themselves were written centuries later. But the Vikings did not stop there. In the late 10th century, Eric the Red, an outlaw from Iceland, sailed even further west. He discovered a massive island, green along the coasts but covered in ice inland. He called it Greenland, hoping to lure more settlers with the name. And it worked. Viking colonies took root there, clinging to the narrow strip of fertile land. For hundreds of years, Norse farmers raised cattle and sheep on Greenland's fragile soil, trading ivory from walrus tusks with Europe. And then came the boldest journey of all. Around the year 1000, a man named Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west from Greenland. Guided by rumors of lands spotted by earlier sailors, he reached a place he called Vinland. Scholars today believe it was somewhere in Newfoundland, Canada. Think about that. Nearly 500 years before Columbus, the Vikings had crossed the Atlantic and set foot in North America. They built small settlements, explored the coasts, and clashed with the native peoples they encountered, whom the sagas called Skraelings. These encounters were fierce and often bloody, and the Vikings, despite their bravery, realized they were too few to hold this vast land. After a few years, they abandoned Vinland, but their achievement was staggering. They had reached a new continent at the edge of the world, the eastward expansion. While some Vikings sailed west into the unknown, others turned east along the great rivers of Russia. These were the Varangians, Norsemen who paddled their ships down the Dnieper and Volga rivers, linking the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and the Caspian. Along the way, they traded furs, honey, and slaves for silver, silk, and spices from the Arab world. To the Slavs, these Norse adventurers were called Rus, a name that would eventually give rise to Russia. In the 9th century, according to legend, a Viking chieftain named Rurik established himself as ruler in Novgorod. His successors, including Oleg and Igor, pushed further south, eventually founding the state of Kievan Rus. They established their capital in Kiev, controlling the vital trade routes between Scandinavia and Byzantium. The Vikings who traveled these rivers were not just raiders. They were merchants and mercenaries. They sold slaves to the markets of Baghdad, where silver coins minted in Arabic lands flowed back into Viking hands. Archaeologists have found hordes of these coins buried in Scandinavia, proof of how far their networks reached. Imagine a Viking warrior wearing a cloak of bear fur, carrying an axe, and jingling a pouch full of Arab dirhams. Warriors of Byzantium. The allure of the East drew many Vikings to the mighty Byzantine Empire. The emperors of Constantinople, impressed by their strength and loyalty, recruited them into an elite unit known as the Varangian Guard. These Norse warriors, towering over the average Byzantine soldier, became the emperor's personal bodyguards. Armed with massive axes, they fought in distant lands, from the deserts of the Middle East to the hills of Italy. In Byzantine records, they are described as fierce and incorruptible. Where others might accept bribes, the Varangians were loyal only to their oath. For a Viking, joining the Guard was a path to immense wealth and honor. Many returned home with stories of the glittering palaces of Constantinople, laden with gold and silk. Traders and raiders. The duality of the Viking spirit was always present. They could be ruthless raiders, but they were also skilled traders and settlers. In Dublin, they founded a thriving town that became a center of commerce, dealing in furs, textiles, and even human beings. Slavery was a grim but important part of the Viking economy, and many captives from raids ended up sold in markets stretching from Ireland to the Middle East. Yet, wherever they went, they also brought culture. They exchanged ideas, crafts, and technology. Viking artisans created jewelry that blended Scandinavian designs with Celtic and Slavic influences. They adopted new weapons and tactics from the people they encountered, and they left their mark in language and law, in place names and traditions that endure even today. The reach of the Vikings. Think about the scale of this for a moment. In one direction, Viking ships were striking the shores of North America. In the other, Viking traders were walking the streets of Baghdad. Few civilizations in history have cast such a wide net. They were explorers in the truest sense, pushing the boundaries of the known world. But these voyages were not only about land and treasure. They were about destiny. The Viking worldview demanded boldness, demanded risk. To sit at home while others sailed for glory was to live in shame. Every voyage was a chance to earn wealth, to earn a name, to be remembered in sagas and songs. And while not every journey ended in success, storms claimed ships, settlers starved, expeditions failed, the spirit of exploration defined them. They were never content with what they had. Always, their eyes were on the horizon, searching for what lay beyond. Legacy of the voyages. The Viking voyages changed the map of the world. They founded cities like Dublin, Kiev, and York. They spread their influence across England, Ireland, France, Russia, and even into the Middle East. They were the first Europeans to set foot in America, a millennium before Columbus. But perhaps the greatest legacy of their journeys was the idea itself, that the world was not fixed, not closed, that it could be crossed, explored, and conquered. In that sense, the Viking spirit lives on, not just in history books, but in the very human drive to seek what lies beyond the horizon. Part 5. Vikings in England and France. By the 9th century, the Viking storm was no longer just a series of raids. It had become a wave of conquest and settlement, crashing down hardest on England and France. For the Anglo-Saxons and the Franks, it was a test of survival. For the Vikings, it was opportunity on a massive scale. England, the Danelaw. England was divided into small kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and others, each vulnerable on its own. Viking armies began to arrive not just as raiders, but as full-fledged invasion forces. In 865, a massive coalition known as the Great Heathen Army landed on English soil. Unlike earlier raids, these warriors did not come to plunder and leave. They came to stay. Over the next decades, the Vikings captured large parts of northern and eastern England. This territory became known as the Danelaw, a region where Viking law, language, and culture dominated. Towns like York became Viking strongholds, buzzing with trade in furs, silver, and slaves. To many locals, it must have felt as if a new nation had appeared overnight. Yet the Saxons were not powerless. In the south, King Alfred of Wessex resisted fiercely. Through strategy, diplomacy, and determination, Alfred held his ground, keeping part of England free. His defense laid the foundation for the later unification of the English kingdom. Still, the Viking influence endured. Even today, countless English words, place names, and traditions come from the Norse settlers who left their mark on the land. France, fire and tribute. Across the Channel, the Franks faced the same nightmare. Viking fleets sailed up the great rivers, the Loire, the Garonne, and most famously the Seine. They plundered towns, burned villages, and spread terror wherever they went. In 845, a fleet led by the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok himself sailed up the Seine and laid siege to Paris. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, had no choice but to pay a massive ransom in gold to make them leave. But the payments never truly bought peace. Again and again, Viking armies returned. Sometimes they burned their way across the countryside. Other times, they were hired as mercenaries, playing one Frankish noble against another. Over time, the Franks realized that the only lasting solution was to give the Vikings land, not as invaders, but as allies. The birth of Normandy. In 911, the Frankish king Charles the Simple struck a deal with a Viking leader named Rollo. Rollo and his followers were granted territory along the lower Seine in exchange for defending it against other raiders. This land became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. The Vikings settled there, intermarried with locals, adopted Christianity, and slowly transformed into the Normans. This was one of the great turning points of history. Within a century, the descendants of Rollo were no longer pagans but powerful Christian lords. And in 1066, a Norman duke named William, descendant of Vikings, would cross the Channel and conquer England itself. The Viking legacy had come full circle, terror and transformation. For England and France, the Viking invasions were devastating. Monasteries burned, cities were looted, and entire regions lived in fear. But the impact was not only destruction. The Vikings reshaped politics, forced kingdoms to unite, and laid the groundwork for new states. Their settlements blended cultures, their words entered languages, and their descendants shaped medieval Europe in ways no one could have predicted. From the Danelaw to Normandy, the Vikings had moved from raiders to rulers. And with each step, they transformed not only themselves, but the very fabric of European history. Part 6. God's Faith and the Turning of Belief. At the heart of Viking life burned a faith as fierce and untamed as the people themselves. Unlike the Christianity spreading across Europe, the Old Norse religion was raw, earthy, and deeply woven into the fabric of daily life. The Vikings did not kneel before distant, perfect gods. They worshipped deities who fought, schemed, and suffered just as humans did. The Norse pantheon, the chief among them was Odin, the All-Father. One-eyed and cloaked, he was the god of wisdom, poetry, and war. Odin sacrificed an eye at the well of Mimir in exchange for knowledge, and hung himself on the world tree, Yggdrasil, for 9 days to gain the secrets of the runes. He embodied the idea that greatness came only through sacrifice. Then there was Thor, perhaps the most beloved god among ordinary people. With his mighty hammer Mjolnir, he defended gods and humans alike against giants and chaos. Farmers and warriors alike prayed to him for strength and protection. There was Freya, goddess of love, fertility, and battle, a reminder that beauty and destruction often walked hand in hand. And Loki, the trickster, whose cunning and betrayal brought both humor and catastrophe. The Norse gods lived in Asgard, high above the world, but their fates were not eternal. Even the gods were doomed. One day, at Ragnarok, they would fall in battle against giants and monsters, and the world itself would burn before being reborn. This sense of inevitable doom shaped the Viking worldview. Life was short, death was certain, but honor and courage could make a name last forever. Rituals and sacrifice. Religion for the Vikings was not confined to temples or churches. It was practiced in open fields, sacred groves, or at stone altars. Animal sacrifices, cattle, horses, or goats, were offered to win the favor of the gods. In rare and grim cases, human sacrifices were also made, especially to Odin, who demanded lives in exchange for victory in battle. Festivals were held to honor the seasons. Yule in winter, celebrating rebirth and the lengthening of days, or harvest feasts in autumn to give thanks for survival. At these gatherings, mead flowed freely, stories were told, and warriors swore oaths beneath the watch of their gods. Rune stones and carvings bore the names of the fallen, linking memory with the divine. Death was not the end, but a passage. The bravest warriors hoped to be carried by the Valkyries to Valhalla, Odin's hall, where they would feast and fight until the final battle. Others might go to Folkvangr, Freya's field, or even to Hel, a cold and shadowy realm for those who died without glory. The coming of Christianity. But even as the Vikings honored their gods, change was coming. Their raids had carried them deep into Christian lands. They saw the power of the cross, the wealth of churches, and the unity of kings bound by one faith. Slowly, through trade, intermarriage, and politics, Christianity began to spread among them. Kings were often the first to convert, sometimes by force, sometimes by strategy. In Denmark, King Harald Bluetooth declared himself Christian in the 10th century, raising monuments to both Odin and Christ as if to bridge the worlds. In Norway, King Olaf Tryggvason spread Christianity with sword in hand, smashing pagan idols and demanding baptism. At first, many Vikings resisted. For them, abandoning Odin and Thor meant abandoning the honor of their ancestors. But over time, Christianity took root. Churches replaced temples, priests replaced shamans, and crosses replaced hammers around warriors' necks. By the 11th century, the old gods were fading into myth, remembered in sagas rather than prayers. A faith transformed. The conversion was not the end of Norse belief, but its transformation. Many traditions survived, disguised within Christian practices. Yule became Christmas, Thor's hammer became the Christian cross for protection, and the stories of heroes lived on in folklore. In truth, the Vikings never saw religion as rigid. For them, strength mattered more than dogma. If Christ could offer victory, wealth, and eternal life, then Christ too deserved respect. And so, the transition was not a betrayal of their past, but an adaptation. One more step in their endless journey of survival and ambition. Part 7. Daily Life of the Vikings. When most people think of Vikings, they imagine roaring warriors charging into battle. But in truth, those dramatic raids were only a small part of their lives. The majority of Vikings spent their days not with sword and shield, but with axe and plow. They were farmers, craftsmen, traders, and parents, living lives both ordinary and extraordinary. Settlements and homes. Viking settlements stretched across Scandinavia and far beyond, from the icy fjords of Norway to the fertile plains of Denmark. Their homes were built from wood, turf, or stone, depending on what materials the land provided. The typical dwelling was the longhouse, a rectangular building with a thatched or turf roof, smoke curling from the central hearth. Inside, life revolved around the fire. It provided heat, light, and a place to cook. Families, servants, and sometimes even livestock shared the same space. Privacy was rare, but warmth and survival were priorities. Benches lined the walls, covered in furs for sleeping. Shields and weapons might hang above the beds, reminding everyone of the ever-present need for defense. Larger longhouses could belong to chieftains, doubling as gathering halls where feasts, councils, and ceremonies took place. These were the heart of Viking communities, buzzing with life, music, and storytelling. Work and food. Life was hard, and every member of the family had a role to play. Men farmed, fished, and hunted. Women managed households, raised children, spun wool, and brewed ale. Contrary to many medieval societies, Viking women had significant rights. They could own property, request divorce, and manage estates while their husbands were away at sea. The Viking diet was simple but hearty. They ate bread made from rye or barley porridge, fish from rivers and seas, and meat from livestock such as pigs, cattle, and goats. They preserved food with salt, smoke, or drying, preparing for long winters. Ale and mead were common drinks, while milk and cheese provided nutrition year-round. Feasts were rare but joyous occasions, with roasted meat, honeyed drinks, and music filling the hall. Clothing and appearance. Despite their fierce reputation, Vikings cared deeply about appearance. They dressed for both practicality and style. Men wore tunics and trousers, often fastened with belts and brooches. Women wore long dresses with aprons, secured by ornate oval brooches that often displayed intricate designs. Wool and linen were the most common fabrics, dyed with natural colors like reds, blues, and yellows. Furs kept them warm in the harsh winters, and jewelry, from silver arm rings to glass beads, was popular among both men and women. Such ornaments were not only decoration, but also a display of wealth and status. And forget the stereotype of dirty barbarians. Archaeological finds show that Vikings valued hygiene. They used combs, tweezers, and ear picks, often made of bone or antler. Grooming was a mark of pride, and clean appearance was linked to honor, childhood, and family. For Viking children, life began with play, but quickly turned to responsibility. Boys learned to handle tools, ride horses, and use weapons. Girls were taught household skills, weaving, and farming tasks. But both grew up listening to sagas, epic tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors. These stories were more than entertainment. They were moral lessons, shaping a child's sense of honor and destiny. Children were cherished, but life was fragile. Many did not survive infancy, and winters were merciless. Yet the family bond was strong, and raising the next generation was seen as vital to carrying on the clan's name and strength. Community and law. Life in Viking society was not lawless chaos. They had a strong system of governance centered around the thing. An assembly where free men gathered to settle disputes, make laws, and decide matters of war and peace. Justice was rooted in honor and compensation, not just punishment. A wrong could often be repaid in silver, though feuds sometimes spiraled into violence if peace could not be kept. These community structures gave Viking society surprising stability. They allowed farming villages and trading towns to thrive, even as warriors sailed off to raid distant shores. A balance of worlds. The daily life of a Viking was a constant balance between survival and celebration, work and war, tradition and change. To outsiders, they might have looked like ruthless marauders, but within their homes, they were parents, artisans, storytellers, and builders. It was this balance that gave their culture its resilience. The same people who could burn monasteries in England also carved delicate jewelry, told beautiful sagas, and cherished family life in their smoky longhouses. Part 8. Eastern Ventures and the Varangians. While the Vikings struck fear into the hearts of Western Europe, many ventured east, following rivers that wound like silver threads through dense forests and across vast plains. These Norse explorers, known as the Varangians, carved paths that connected Scandinavia to the Black Sea, the Caspian, and beyond. Their journeys were not just raids. They were trade, diplomacy, and empire-building rolled into one. Down the rivers. The Varangians traveled rivers like the Neva, Fokhov, Dnieper, and Volga, carrying goods and people with astonishing speed. They moved in longboats, sometimes dragging them across portages, linking one waterway to the next. Every stop was an opportunity, trading furs, honey, and amber from the north for silver coins, silk, spices, and luxury goods from the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates. Along the way, they founded towns and fortresses. Novgorod and later Kiev became major centers of power, trade, and culture. Local Slavic populations called them Rus, and eventually, these Norsemen formed the ruling dynasties of Kievan Rus, blending Norse customs with Slavic traditions. Through marriage, diplomacy, and military prowess, they became an inseparable part of Eastern European history. The Varangian Guard. Some Vikings went even further. The allure of wealth and prestige drew them to Byzantium, the jewel of the medieval world. There, they joined the Varangian Guard, an elite unit of warriors who served as the emperor's personal bodyguards. These men, often towering and fierce, were valued for their loyalty, combat skill, and fearlessness. The Varangians fought in campaigns across the Mediterranean and the Middle East. They were both soldiers and symbols, proof that even faraway northern warriors could hold their ground in one of the world's most sophisticated empires. Many returned home with gold, silk, and stories of lands most Scandinavians could not imagine. Trade and cultural exchange. Eastern voyages were not only about conquest. The Vikings were consummate traders. Silver dirhams from the Caliphate have been found buried in Scandinavia, evidence of far-reaching trade networks. Furs, honey, and slaves moved south. Silk, coins, and exotic goods moved north. Along these routes, ideas flowed as well. Shipbuilding techniques, weapon designs, artistic styles, and even political concepts traveled with the merchants and warriors. The Vikings adapted to new cultures without losing their identity, blending practicality with the adventurous spirit that had carried them from the North Sea to the Black Sea. Contact with distant lands. From the rivers of Rus, some Vikings pushed further south into the Caspian Sea and even glimpsed the edges of Persia. Others ventured along the Mediterranean coasts, visiting parts of Italy, Sicily, and North Africa. These expeditions brought them into contact with Muslim, Byzantine, and other Mediterranean cultures. They saw cities of marble and gold, armies unlike anything in the north, and marketplaces teeming with spices, textiles, and treasures. These encounters had a lasting impact. Not only did they enrich the Vikings materially, but they also broadened their worldview. They realized that the world was bigger than their fjords and forests, that wealth, culture, and power existed far beyond the north. Legacy of the eastward expeditions. The eastern ventures of the Vikings show a side of them often overshadowed by the terror of their raids. They were navigators, traders, empire builders, and cultural bridges. Their voyages laid the foundations for states, trade networks, and military alliances in Eastern Europe. The Kievan Rus, Varangian Guard, and river trading towns were all testaments to the Vikings' ability to adapt, conquer, and thrive far from home. By traveling east, the Vikings connected the north to the south, the Baltic to the Mediterranean, and Scandinavia to the Islamic world. They were not merely raiders but explorers who reshaped the political, economic, and cultural landscape of medieval Europe. In this sense, the Viking Age was more than the story of raids and battles. It was the story of a people who refused to be confined by the limits of their homeland. Whether on the open seas of the Atlantic, the rivers of Rus, or the streets of Constantinople, the Vikings left an indelible mark on the medieval world, one journey at a time. Part 9. The End of the Viking Age. By the late 11th century, the Viking world that had once seemed unstoppable began to change. The same daring explorers, warriors, and raiders who had struck fear across Europe were gradually absorbed into the lands they had once terrorized. The Age of the Vikings was coming to an end, not with a single battle, but through cultural, political, and religious transformation. Integration and settlement. Many Vikings had settled permanently in the territories they had once raided. In England, the Danelaw became a lasting influence, with Norse laws, customs, and language blending with Anglo-Saxon culture. In France, the Norsemen of Normandy had become Christian lords, and their descendants, the Normans, would go on to conquer England in 1066. In Ireland, Viking towns like Dublin evolved into centers of trade and governance. Settlement and integration meant that the Viking identity began to shift. No longer were they primarily raiders. They became rulers, merchants, and citizens. Their military power was still formidable, but diplomacy and alliances increasingly replaced the sword as the path to influence. The role of Christianity. Religion played a crucial role in the decline of traditional Viking raiding culture. As more Vikings converted to Christianity, their societies adopted new moral codes, legal systems, and alliances with other Christian kingdoms. Pagan raids became less socially acceptable, and Christian kings could call on the church to mediate disputes rather than resort to open conflict. The church also offered education, literacy, and centralized authority, tools that replaced the old clan-based governance structures. Monasteries that had once been targets of Viking raids now became allies, centers of learning, and sources of wealth. Gradually, the cultural identity of the Vikings fused with the broader European medieval world. Political changes. In Scandinavia itself, centralized kingdoms began to emerge. Kings consolidated power over regions that had once been ruled by independent chieftains. National identities were forming, reducing the constant internal warfare that had driven some Vikings to raid abroad. stronger monarchies, combined with improved defenses in neighboring lands, made large-scale raids increasingly risky and less profitable. Economic shifts. Trade networks, once dominated by Viking merchants, had expanded and diversified. Northern Europe was more connected than ever before, and wealth could be earned through commerce rather than plunder. The rising cost and danger of raiding, combined with the rewards of legal trade, further encouraged Vikings to abandon the old ways. The legacy lives on. Though the era of Viking raids ended, their impact was permanent. They had reshaped Europe, from England to Russia, through settlement, trade, and warfare. Many modern European cities, Dublin, York, Novgorod, were founded or expanded by Vikings. Their laws, language, and cultural practices influenced generations, and their legendary tales lived on in sagas and folklore. The Vikings' legacy also endured in the bloodlines of European nobility. The Normans of France, descended from Vikings, became key players in medieval Europe. Kings and warriors could trace their ancestry back to these northern adventurers, keeping the Viking spirit alive in new forms of power. The end of raids, the beginning of influence. By the 12th century, the image of the Viking as a marauding warrior was largely a thing of the past. What remained was a people who had conquered, settled, traded, and influenced far-flung lands. They had adapted to new religions, laws, and kingdoms, proving that survival depended not just on strength and courage, but on flexibility and vision. The Viking Age ended not in defeat, but in transformation. The raiders became rulers. The explorers became settlers. The warriors became part of the societies they had once fought. And though their longships no longer prowled the coasts, the spirit of the Vikings, daring, resourceful, and unstoppable, continued to shape Europe for centuries to come. Part 10. Legacy of the Vikings. The Viking Age may have ended over 900 years ago, but its echoes are everywhere. In the lands they settled, the stories they told, and the culture they shaped. From Scandinavia to England, France, Russia, and even North America, the Vikings left a mark that transcends time. Cultural impact. The Vikings were storytellers as much as warriors. Their sagas, written centuries later, recount the deeds of gods and heroes, blending history with legend. These tales influenced literature far beyond the North, inspiring epic narratives and heroic ideals that continue to resonate today. Figures like Ragnar Lothbrok, Eric the Red, and Leif Erikson became icons, larger than life, embodying courage, adventure, and the human desire to explore the unknown. Even everyday language carries traces of their presence. Many English words, from sky to knife, have Norse origins. Place names across England, Ireland, and Scotland reflect Viking settlements. Grimsby, Derby, and Whitby all tell of their northern founders. In Normandy, the Norman conquest of England further spread Viking bloodlines and customs across Europe. Technological and navigational legacy. Vikings were master shipbuilders. Their longships, light yet sturdy, allowed them to navigate oceans, rivers, and estuaries. The principles behind these vessels influenced shipbuilding for generations, inspiring designs that enabled later explorers to reach lands far beyond the known world. Their innovations in navigation, using the sun, stars, and even primitive compasses, highlight their ingenuity and adventurous spirit. Political and social influence. The Vikings reshaped medieval Europe's political landscape. Through settlement, conquest, and alliances, they influenced the formation of states such as England, Normandy, and Kievan Rus. Their concepts of law, governance, and trade networks laid foundations that would endure long after the longships vanished. In many ways, the Vikings helped create the Europe that we recognize today. Mythology and modern fascination. The gods and myths of the Vikings remain a powerful cultural force. Odin, Thor, Freya, and Loki continue to appear in books, films, and television, captivating new generations. Modern media often romanticizes the Vikings, portraying them as fearless adventurers or enigmatic anti-heroes. While these portrayals sometimes exaggerate violence, they also reflect the enduring fascination with a people who lived boldly and lived free. The Viking spirit. Above all, the Viking legacy is one of exploration, courage, and adaptability. They sailed into the unknown, facing storms, hostile lands, and uncertain futures. They raided, traded, and settled far from home, never losing their identity but constantly evolving. Their society combined pragmatism with imagination, law with liberty, and war with storytelling. In many ways, the Viking spirit lives on in humanity's drive to explore, to take risks, and to leave a mark on the world. The longships may have rotted, the swords may have rusted, and the kingdoms may have changed hands countless times. Yet the ideas they embodied, boldness, resilience, and the pursuit of honor, are timeless. Remembering the Vikings, museums, archaeological sites, and preserved runestones keep their memory alive. In Scandinavia, cities celebrate Viking festivals, reenactments, and maritime traditions. Scholars continue to uncover their stories, challenging old myths and revealing the complexity of their lives. From their fearsome raids to their far-reaching voyages, from their gods to their laws, the Vikings remain one of history's most compelling peoples. Ultimately, the Viking Age is a reminder that even a people from the coldest, harshest lands can shape the course of history. Through courage, ingenuity, and unyielding spirit, they carved a legacy that spans continents and centuries. The echoes of their longships still stir the imagination, calling us to remember the warriors, explorers, and storytellers who dared to challenge the limits of their world. The Vikings are gone, but their story is eternal. A saga of fire and frost, of oceans crossed and worlds discovered, of honor, myth, and adventure that continues to inspire the world today.